One cold December night in 1773, the calm waters of Boston Harbor turned into a battlefield, not with guns or cannons, but with crates of tea. What began as an argument over a simple drink exploded into an act of defiance so bold, it shook the British Empire to its core and set America on the road to revolution. It started with something as ordinary as a cup of tea, but what followed would shake an empire. For years, the American colonies had lived under British rule, their lives tied to decisions made across the ocean by men they had never met. At first, this arrangement was tolerable, but as time passed, it became a burden. Taxes piled up, restrictions multiplied, and the sense of being controlled without any representation in Parliament gnawed at their pride. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and now the Tea Act of 1773, each law felt like another iron link in a chain that was slowly binding them. To British leaders, the Tea Act seemed harmless. By giving the East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea in the colonies, they thought they were saving a failing company and lowering prices for colonists. But in America, the measure struck like an insult. Cheaper tea meant nothing when it came with a tax they had no voice in approving. Imagine being told you could only buy your morning tea from one company at a price decided by people who did not even consider you their equal. The cry of "no taxation without representation" grew louder than ever. In Boston, the defiance was particularly fierce. Resistance had become a way of life. Taverns buzzed with heated debates, meeting halls echoed with speeches, and boycotts were organized with precision. The ships carrying tea, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived like floating symbols of oppression, their holds heavy with cargo no one wanted. Crowds gathered at the docks, demanding the ships return to England without unloading their goods. But the governor stood firm, insisting the tea must be landed and the tax paid. Tension thickened in the December cold. Merchants feared ruin if they angered Britain. Loyalists warned of terrible consequences, but ordinary men and women felt the moment had come to draw a line. This wasn't just about tea anymore. It was about dignity, freedom, and the right to shape their own future. As the ship sat anchored in the harbor, guarded by British authority, the air around Boston was electric. A storm was coming, not of weather, but of will, and once unleashed, it would change history forever. December 16, 1773, was not just another winter evening in Boston. It was the night when whispers turned into action. Earlier that day, nearly 7,000 people, men, women, and even children, crammed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in the city. They argued fiercely. Should the tea be returned to England, left to rot aboard the ships, or destroyed outright? Governor Thomas Hutchinson made his position clear. The ships would not leave until the tea was unloaded and the tax paid. But the people of Boston were equally firm. The tea would never touch American soil. As darkness fell, the decision was made, though not in words. A group of men slipped quietly into disguise. They smeared soot on their faces, wrapped themselves in blankets, and added feathers to their hair, adopting the appearance of Mohawk Indians. It wasn't a perfect disguise, but it wasn't meant to fool anyone. It was a statement. Tonight they acted not as individuals, but as a united people. They marched toward Griffin's Wharf with a sense of purpose. Witnesses described the group as disciplined, not chaotic. There was no drunken rioting, no wild shouting. The men climbed aboard the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver with determination. Armed with hatchets, they cracked open chest after chest, 342 in total, and hurled the contents into the harbor. The air was filled with the smell of broken leaves as the tide turned dark with tea, enough to make thousands of cups. Crowds stood at the docks, watching in awe. Some cheered, some whispered prayers, and others shook with fear of what might come next. For 3 hours, the Patriots worked steadily. They took nothing for themselves, and when the job was done, they swept the decks clean, as if to show the world this was no act of theft but of principle. When silence finally returned, the harbor told the story. Waves lapped against the empty ships, and the surface of the water shimmered with the bitter brew of defiance. No lives had been lost, No blood had been shed, but a message louder than gunfire had been sent across the ocean. Boston would not be broken. When news of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic, it landed in London like a hammer blow. To British leaders, this was not a protest but an act of open rebellion. The loss of nearly $10,000 worth of tea, an astronomical sum at the time, was seen as a direct attack on both the Crown's authority and the financial health of the East India Company. Parliament was furious, and their response was swift and uncompromising. In 1774, they unleashed what came to be known in America as the Coercive Acts, or more bitterly, the Intolerable Acts. Boston's harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for in full, choking off the city's lifeblood of trade. The Massachusetts government was stripped of much of its autonomy, its councilors now chosen by the Crown instead of the people. British soldiers, already a source of resentment, were granted even greater authority, and colonists were required to house and feed them under the Quartering Act. These laws were not just punishment. They were meant to crush Boston's spirit and send a warning to the other colonies. This is the price of defiance. But Britain miscalculated. Instead of dividing the colonies, the harsh measures forged a sense of unity. In towns far from Boston, people rallied to send food, firewood, and money to help their fellow colonists survive the blockade. The First Continental Congress was called, bringing together leaders from different colonies to coordinate a collective response. What began as one city's act of defiance was now transforming into a continental struggle. For the people of Boston, the price was heavy. Families endured shortages of food and firewood through harsh winters. Businesses collapsed under the weight of the blockade. Redcoats patrolled the streets, their very presence a daily reminder of subjugation. Britain hoped fear would restore obedience, but fear has a way of hardening resolve. The Tea Party had lit a flame that no punishment could extinguish. In seeking to discipline Boston, Britain had only fueled the colonists' determination. Whispers of independence grew louder. What had once seemed an impossible dream now began to feel like destiny. Though the Boston Tea Party became legendary, it was not celebrated by all. Many colonists were deeply uneasy about what had happened. To some, it was an act of courage. To others, it was nothing more than vandalism. Merchants feared the destruction of goods would ruin vital trade relationships. Loyalists scorned the act as lawless behavior that would only bring Britain's wrath. Even Benjamin Franklin, admired on both sides of the Atlantic, publicly stated that the East India Company should be repaid. He believed the destruction of property was unjustifiable, even in protest. In households across the colonies, families were divided. A son might cheer the rebels while his father shook his head, warning of the disaster that rebellion would bring. Newspapers carried fiery editorials, some praising the defiance, others condemning it. Clergymen urged their congregations to remember their duty to obey lawful authority, while radicals insisted that freedom required bold action. The debate went beyond the tea itself. Colonists asked themselves, was this bravery or was it recklessness? Could a small group of colonies truly stand against the might of the British Empire? Or had Boston dragged them all toward a war they could never win? Britain, watching from across the ocean, hoped these divisions would spread and weaken the I movement. Yet paradoxically, Britain's harsh response left many who disapproved of the Tea Party with little choice. Neutrality was becoming impossible. The closing of Boston's harbor didn't just punish radicals, it punished ordinary citizens too. Farmers who had never set foot in Boston felt the sting when their goods could not be shipped. Merchants far away realized their own trade could one day be restricted. Slowly, the colonies began to see that if Boston fell, they might be next. The Tea Party drew a line in the sand. Some crossed it eagerly, others reluctantly, but almost all were forced to make a choice. Out of that tension, a new identity began to form, not just as subjects of the Crown, but as Americans. When we look back at that night on Boston Harbor, it's clear the protest was about more than tea. It was about principle. The destruction of 342 chests of tea was a symbolic act, bloodless yet powerful, that carried consequences far beyond what anyone standing on the docks could have imagined. The intolerable acts that followed were meant to silence resistance, but instead, they gave it fuel. Leaders in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond, who once sought compromise, now spoke of independence with greater conviction. The First Continental Congress met in 1774, planting seeds of unity among colonies that had once seen themselves as separate. Farmers, merchants, and townsfolk alike began to prepare quietly for the possibility of war. Muskets were cleaned, powder was stored, and militias drilled. The image of patriots disguised as Mohawks became more than just a story. It became a rallying cry. It showed that ordinary men could take extraordinary risks when pushed to the edge. The Boston Tea Party transformed from a local protest into a legend that inspired courage across the continent. Britain, in its arrogance, underestimated the colonists' resolve. They saw a scattered people divided by distance and loyalty, but what they had actually created was a shared cause. Within 2 years, the first shots would ring out at Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolution would begin. The legacy of the Boston Tea Party is not only that it sparked a revolution, but that it revealed a truth still remembered today. Small acts of defiance can have enormous consequences. Tossing tea into the harbor did not win freedom, but it made freedom inevitable. That cold December night showed the world that America would not bow quietly, and it lit a fire that would burn until independence was won. The ripples from that night in Boston Harbor spread far beyond the water's edge. 342 chests of tea sank, but in their place, a new idea rose, that ordinary people could stand against the mightiest empire on earth. The Boston Tea Party was more than a protest. It was a spark, and once lit, no army, no king, and no empire could extinguish it. The revolution was no longer a question of if, but when.